Welcome to another video by Better Pics. Just a very quick one today to show you some techniques of adjusting images in Adobe Camera Raw. So we will be working on RAW files. You can see I've got a selection here ready to go, and we'll just be looking at basic adjustments. So you can see with the 6 photos here that all of their exposures are fairly correct, so there's not a great deal that I would have changed at the shooting point in creating these images. However, as with any RAW file, exactly the same as a negative in the film days, it's always good to make some adjustments to bring the most out of the file, because generally RAW files create a fairly flat image. Generally speaking, not always, depending on the color profiles you have set on your camera. So yeah, it just means that we can get a little bit more out of our RAW files, and we can make sure that we end up with an optimum image. So we're going to have a look at this particular image today. I photographed this a couple of months ago in Scotland. It was a fairly cold morning, as you can see by the frost on the grass, and it was right next to a small stream leading down into a larger river and lake. So to open this image in Adobe Camera Raw, we're just going to select the image, right click and open in Camera Raw. You can also obviously select the image and come up here to this little aperture looking wheel where it says open in Camera Raw, whichever you prefer. Open in Camera Raw, and that will open the image directly into Adobe Camera Raw, as we can see here. So initially we're just going to look at the basic tools today to help to improve the quality of this image. As I mentioned, the image exposure is in a really good place, so there's I certainly wouldn't have photographed the image any darker or lighter. There's detail in all parts of the image, as you can see by the histogram up the top there, which is a good starting point. So we'll just go through what some of the controls actually do. So the first one we're going to look at is temperature and tint. So at the moment the white balance is as it was shot in camera, and the profile is Adobe Color. So with the temperature, it works very much the same as your temperature in camera. If you slide the slider bar to the right, you can see the image is going to become warmer, and the temperature, which is measured in degrees Kelvin, is going to become higher. If we slide that slider to the left, then the image is going to become cooler. Now, how you actually use all of these tools is really up to your own creative approach and what you want to achieve with the image as an outcome. So this is simply my approach and my take on this image, and as I mentioned earlier, just looking at what the tools are available. If we look at tint just below, this adjusts the amount of cyan and magenta that appears in your digital file. So you can see as I've slid that to the right, we're getting more and more magenta, and back to the left, which I did just before, we're getting more and more cyan. We're just going to go back to as it was shot, and just so that we go back to our starting point. Coming down a little bit further, we look at the exposure. Now, exposure is exactly the same as exposure in your camera. So increase exposure, the image becomes brighter. Decrease exposure, the image becomes darker. Again, it really is just an adjustment based on your own personal taste. This starts as default as 0, which is the exposure that the image you've shot. So if you're wanting to go back to reset the exposure back to what it was, then you just hit 0. And we're back to where the image began. Contrast, this is something that I think most people would understand. So increasing contrast will increase the difference between the blacks and the highlights, or the shadows and the highlights, and decreasing contrast will decrease the difference between the shadows and the highlights. So you can see the very clear effect there. Again, we'll go back to 0 just to center that. Highlights is a fantastic tool, and one that I use quite often, and it literally controls the highlights of the image. So say for example, if you have clouds that are a little bit blown out, if you've lost a little bit of detail, then you can recover those highlights by decreasing. I'm just going to decrease that slider, and you can certainly see in the ice on the leaves of the grass that we've retained a little bit more detail. If I go to the other end of the scale, you can see it's those highlights, or those bright parts of the image, are becoming brighter. I'll just go back and center that as well. Shadows works exactly the same as highlights, except it's obviously the shadows. So if I increase the shadows, then the detail in the shadow area increases. If I decrease the shadows, then the detail or brightness values in the shadow areas also decreases. We'll go back to 0 again. Whites, very similar to highlights. but a slightly different effect, obviously, as you can see here, as I've slid that to the right and to the left. A little bit similar in some ways to the highlights, but just a little bit different as well. And obviously blacks as well, adjusting the blacks there. If I increase the blacks, it tends to decrease contrast. If I reduce the blacks, then it crushes, which is a term you'll hear quite a lot, the shadows, to the point where there is no detail in the shadows. In fact, if I hover my mouse over that dark area there, you can see the RGB values up on the top right hand corner here. Go down to 0. So if you were to print that image, it would just be a solid mass of black. You wouldn't actually see any detail. All right, clarity. Clarity, dehaze, vibrance and saturation. Clarity and dehaze tend to help with the sharpness or contrast of the image, for want of better words. It's always good just to zoom in a little bit, at least to 100%. We're going to go to 200%, just so that you can really see on a pixel by pixel basis the effect working. So if I increase that clarity, you can see that it just tends to increase the contrast, and if I decrease, it's almost like a soft filter effect. So if we go back to 0, which is the starting point, I mean, there's good detail in there to begin with. Some images do respond well to a slight increase in clarity, just so that you get a little bit more of that detail. However, it is on a picture by picture basis. The big thing with photography, and certainly editing photographs, whether it's in a darkroom or on a computer, is that there's no one approach to image editing. It really is, you take your approach based on the image, based on the result that you want, based on the capture settings at the time and the results that you got at the time of capture. So there's a lot of considerations there. All right, so down to dehaze. We'll just increase that a little bit. This has been a very popular option to use when you have a slightly foggy or if there's a bit of cloud around. Obviously, as I increase that, you can see it's a slight increase in contrast and detail again. If I decrease that, then it's having a very interesting effect. Might just zoom out and have a look at that as a whole. Dehaze is very interesting. I'm quite surprised at that, to be honest. We'll take that back to 0, and again, that may be a setting that works well for particular images. Saturation, we'll just skip vibrance for the second. Saturation is basically increasing the intensity of the colors. You can see as I slide to the absolute extreme there, the colors become quite intense, and if I decrease saturation to -100, it goes to a black and white image. Now that's one way for future reference to create a black and white image in Adobe Camera Raw. However, it's not the way that I would suggest. I will be creating another video on why that is. However, for now, let's just take note that if we decrease saturation to -100, it does turn it into a black and white image. We'll go back to +1. Now, as I mentioned, saturation affects all of the image equally. Vibrance, not so much. Vibrance tends to only affect parts of the image that the algorithms that have been built by Adobe determine the parts of the image that are lacking saturation. So it doesn't apply saturation evenly, only to the areas that it deems are needing an increase in color saturation. Again, this is going to be responded to differently depending on the image, and my suggestion is to season to taste. Test it on each image and go with whatever fulfills your creative vision. All right, so we'll take that back to 0. So that's just some of the tools that are available in Adobe Camera Raw for your basic image editing. There are plenty of other tools available, as there is with all of the Adobe suite. However, we will be going through those in other videos. Hope you've enjoyed and look forward to seeing you soon. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and more videos to come.